The night Harlow Vance handed her a glass of champagne and whispered, "This is the last board meeting you'll ever ruin for me." Mirabel Weston didn't flinch. She took the glass, smiled at him the way she'd smiled at difficult clients for 15 years, and set it down on the edge of the mahogany table without drinking a drop. She already knew what was in it. Not poison, nothing so dramatic. Just something to make her foggy, slow, easy to redirect. Harlow had always preferred his weapons quiet. That was the thing about men who married women smarter than them. They never fought fair. They just waited until you were distracted, and then they moved on your blind side. But Mirabel Weston had not had a blind side since she was 32 years old. She was 41 now, and she had been planning this particular evening for the better part of 8 months. It hadn't started as a plan. It had started as a feeling, the specific hollow feeling of standing in your own conference room and realizing that the man you'd built a company with had quietly, methodically been building a case against you. Not against you personally. Against your signature on documents. Against your access codes. Against your seat at the table that your own grandfather had commissioned from a craftsman in Vermont 40 years ago. Harlow had come into her life the way a lot of things did when you weren't paying close enough attention. Through a mutual friend, at a charity event, with very good manners and an excellent suit, and the kind of easy confidence that reads as safety when you are 34 years old and haven't slept a full night in 3 years, because you are running a company and grieving a parent and trying to remember what it felt like to be a person rather than a machine. He was charming. He was thoughtful. He remembered small things, the kind of tea she preferred, the name of her college roommate, the anniversary of her father's passing. He asked her questions and actually waited for the answers. She married him 2 years later. She gave him a seat on the board of Weston Capital Management a year after that, because he had a background in private equity and she trusted him, and because the firm her father had left her was growing faster than she could manage alone, and she wanted a partner. A real one. She had not understood at the time that Harlow Vance had a very specific idea of what partnership meant, and it did not involve her. The first sign was small enough to explain away. A client meeting she hadn't been told about. Harlow's assistant said it had been a scheduling error. Mirabel had looked at the assistant, a young woman named Petra who wore her hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful, and she had accepted the explanation because she was tired, and because there were 14 other things demanding her attention, and because she still believed, at that point, that her husband was fundamentally on her side. The second sign was harder to explain. She found a string of emails, not by snooping, but because Harlow had left his laptop open on the kitchen island, and her eyes had caught her own name in the subject line, and she had leaned in before she could stop herself. The thread was between Harlow and 2 board members she had personally recruited. Men she had known for years. The subject line read, "Transition Planning, Confidential." She read 4 lines, and then she stepped back from the counter and walked very carefully to the bathroom, and ran the cold water, and gripped the edge of the sink, and breathed. 4 lines was enough. They were planning to restructure her role, to move her into a founder emeritus position. A title that sounded respectful and meant nothing. A title that had no voting rights, no operational authority, no seat at the table. A title that was, in the language of corporate maneuvering, a very polite way of saying you are finished here. And Harlow was the one who had drafted the language. She turned off the faucet. She dried her hands. She walked back to the kitchen, closed his laptop gently, made herself a cup of coffee, and sat down at the breakfast table and thought for a long time. She did not cry. She had cried when her father died. She had cried at her wedding. She had cried privately on 3 or 4 other occasions that she could count on one hand. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she was especially not a woman who cried when she could be planning instead. By the time Harlow came downstairs that morning, she had already called her attorney. Her attorney was a woman named Iris Pemberton Cole, who'd been practicing corporate and family law for 27 years, and who had, in those 27 years, developed a very particular expression that she wore when a client sat across from her desk and told her something that was both completely surprising and completely predictable. She wore that expression now. "Tell me everything," Iris said. "From the beginning," Mirabel told her. She told her about the board emails. She told her about the client meeting she'd been excluded from, and then the one after that, and the one after that. Because now that she was looking, she could see the pattern, the slow and deliberate erosion of her authority that she had mistaken for delegation and trust. She told her about the way Harlow had started attending investor dinners alone, representing the firm publicly in contexts where she had always been the face of Weston Capital, saying she was stepping back to focus on strategy. She had never said that. She had never said anything close to that. She told Iris about the company credit accounts that had been quietly restructured, not illegally, but cleverly, in ways that shifted the operational control toward the partnership entity that Harlow had suggested they create 3 years ago for tax efficiency. She'd agreed to it then. She had not understood what she was agreeing to. Iris listened to all of it. She took notes in a legal pad in her careful, small handwriting. When Mirabel finished, she set down her pen and looked at her across the desk. "He's been doing this for a while," Iris said. "It was not a question. At least 2 years," Mirabel said. "Probably longer. I think I gave him the map, and he just followed it." "Do you want to leave considered this?" "I want to leave it correctly," she said. "I want everything that's mine before I leave." Iris nodded. "Then we need to start immediately." The next 6 months were the most disciplined of Mirabel's life, and she had spent years building a firm from the inside out, so that was saying something. She learned to move through her own life like someone who was not paying attention, while paying the most acute and careful attention she had ever paid to anything. She went to dinner with Harlow. She attended the functions. She smiled at the right moments and asked the right questions and showed no sign whatsoever that she knew. She did not know everything, not yet. But she was learning. Iris connected her with a forensic financial analyst named Otis Reed, a quiet man in his 50s who had spent a decade at the SEC before moving to private practice. Otis did not speak much, but when he did, he was precise and irrefutable. He went through 7 years of Weston Capital's financial records, with the kind of attention that most people reserve for things they genuinely love. What he found took Mirabel's breath away, and she was not a woman who was easily breathless. There was money moving through the partnership entity, not in enormous amounts that would flag audits, but in a consistent pattern, redirected into a subsidiary account that Harlow had established 2 years ago under a name that sounded like a legitimate investment vehicle. Money that was technically within the structure of the partnership, but that Harlow had been routing toward a separate fund that he alone controlled. A fund that, based on the documentation Otis assembled, was already seeded with roughly $4 million. It wasn't theft, exactly. It was closer to positioning. Harlow was setting up an exit of his own. He was planning to leave Weston Capital and take as much of it with him as the paperwork would allow. Mirabel sat with that for 2 days. She went for long runs in the early morning when Harlow was still asleep. She called her sister in Phoenix and talked about everything except the things she was thinking about. She stood at the window of her home office at 11 o'clock at night and looked at the city lights and understood, fully and without any remaining softness, that the man sleeping down the hall had married her as a strategy. She had been an acquisition. He had just been waiting for the right moment to liquidate. Fine, she had been acquired before. She knew how to fight acquisitions. The woman's name was Philippa Strand. She was 31, worked in venture capital, and had met Harlow at a conference in San Francisco that Mirabel had chosen not to attend because she'd been closing a deal in New York. Mirabel learned about Philippa not through the dramatic discovery of texts or hotel receipts, but through a simple piece of information that Otis turned up during his research. Harlow had recently purchased a furnished apartment in the Tribeca neighborhood under an LLC name, and the utilities had been put in the name of a Philippa Strand. It was almost elegant, in a terrible way. Mirabel had the apartment address. She did not go there. There was no version of this story where she stood outside someone's apartment and confronted anyone in the street. That was not who she was, and more practically, it was not what the situation required. What the situation required was documentation, and time, and precision. She gave it all 3. She told no one outside of Iris and Otis, not her sister, not her 2 closest friends, both of whom would have been instantly loudly furious on her behalf, and both of whom she genuinely could not risk. People who are furious make calls. People who make calls create ripples. Ripples reach Harlow. She needed still water. Every weekend morning, while Harlow slept late, she sat in her home office and worked through the financial architecture of what was coming. She had been a shareholder in Weston Capital before she had been a wife. She had founding documents, original equity structures, intellectual property filings, and 15 years of board minutes that Harlow's name did not appear in. She had personal investment accounts that predated the marriage by a decade, assets that were hers in a way that was not legally ambiguous. A trust her father had established for her when she was 26 that Harlow had never touched because she had never given him access to. The partnership entity was the complicated part. But Otis had found enough in the documentation patterns to suggest that Harlow's conduct constituted a breach of fiduciary duty, and Iris had found enough in the origination structure of the entity to argue that key assets had been misrepresented during the formation. It would be contested. It would be expensive. It would be long. Mirabel prepared for long. The board meeting was scheduled for the third Thursday of November. Mirabel had known about it for 6 weeks because she had a standing relationship with her assistant of 12 years. A woman named Bet, who had worked for Mirabel's father before working for Mirabel and who had, in those 12 years, demonstrated a loyalty that was worth more than any contractual protection Mirabel could have put in place. Bet had noticed things over the past year. She hadn't said anything directly, because that was not Bet's style. She had just started keeping a log, date, time, observation, notes. She had quietly handed Mirabel a manila envelope 4 months ago in the parking garage below the building, said only, "I thought you should have this," and then walked back to the elevator without another word. The envelope contained 63 pages. Mirabel had read all 63 pages in a single sitting, and then she had called Iris and said, "We need to move faster." The evening of the board meeting, Mirabel dressed with the kind of care she usually reserved for regulatory presentations. Charcoal silk blouse, structured jacket, the specific pair of pearl earrings her father had given her when she passed her Series 65. She looked, if anyone was paying attention, exactly as she always looked. Composed, prepared, quietly authoritative. Harlow was already in the dining room when she came downstairs. He had his jacket on, his phone in his hand. He looked up when she walked in, and something crossed his face, something calculated, and then he smiled and handed her the champagne. "This is the last board meeting you'll ever ruin for me." She set the glass down. She smiled. She picked up her bag. "Shall we?" she said. The board of Weston Capital consisted of 7 members. 5 of them were there when Mirabel and Harlow arrived. 2 were joining remotely. The mahogany table was her grandfather's, shipped from Vermont in 1984, and every time she sat at its head she thought of him briefly. The particular smell of his study, the sound of him on the phone when she was small, talking to clients in the measured and unhurried voice that she had spent decades trying to reproduce. She sat at the head of the table. Harlow sat 3 chairs to her left. For the first 20 minutes, the meeting proceeded normally. Quarterly reporting, an update on 2 portfolio positions, a discussion about a regulatory filing that was due in January. Mirabel ran through it efficiently the way she always did. She asked questions. She listened. She made 2 decisions that needed to be made and tabled 1 item for follow-up. Then she said, "I'd like to move to a matter that wasn't on today's agenda." Harlow looked up. "I've become aware," Mirabel said, in a voice that was as calm and even as a table surface, "of some financial irregularities in the partnership entity structure that I believe the board needs to examine." She reached into the leather portfolio in front of her and slid a packet of documents to each board member. 7 copies, pre-prepared, each flagged with small blue tabs. Otis Reed, our forensic financial analyst, completed a full audit of the entity structure last week. I've asked him to join us. The door opened. Otis walked in with his laptop and a composed expression and took a seat at the far end of the table. Harlow said, "Mirabel, I'll also note," she continued without looking at him, "that I filed for dissolution of the partnership entity this morning, and that Iris Pemberton Cole at Pemberton Cole, LLP, has been retained to manage the proceedings." She looked up now, at the board as a whole, in the way her father had taught her, not confrontationally, but with the specific kind of authority that comes from knowing exactly what you know. "I've prepared a brief summary of the relevant findings. Otis will walk us through the details." The room was very quiet. Harlow's face had gone a particular shade of pale that Mirabel had never seen on him before, and she had known him for 7 years. One of the board members, a man named Douglas, who had been on the board since her father's time, and who had, she suspected, known something was wrong for months without knowing what to do about it, looked down at the document in front of him and then looked up at Mirabel and gave a very small nod. She received it. The meeting lasted 3 more hours. Harlow spoke twice. Both times he was interrupted. Once by Otis presenting a specific entry in the financial documentation, and once by Mirabel, who let him speak for approximately 90 seconds before saying very quietly, "Harlow, You're describing a transaction that is documented on page 14 of the audit. Would you like to address the documentation directly? He didn't. At 11:15 in the evening, the board voted to place the partnership entity into formal review, to temporarily restrict all outgoing transfers pending the legal proceedings, and to bring in an independent compliance officer for a 90-day audit. Mirabel thanked each board member. She walked Otis to the elevator. She came back to the conference room, where Harlow was still sitting in his chair, very still, his phone face down on the table in front of him. She picked up her portfolio. She picked up her bag. "I had the locks changed this morning," she said. "At the house. Your things will be at the front desk of the building by Friday. I've arranged for storage." She paused. "I'd recommend getting an attorney who specializes in business disputes. This isn't going to be a simple divorce." Harlow said her name. Just her name, Mirabel, in a tone she'd never heard from him before. Something raw in it, almost disbelieving. She looked at him for a moment. "You treated me like I was an asset to be managed," she said. "You forgot that I'm the one who knows how to manage assets." She walked out. The lobby was empty at that hour, except for the overnight security officer and a cleaning crew working at the far end. The air smelled like floor polish and the particular coldness of a building after hours. Mirabel walked through the glass doors and stood on the sidewalk and let the November air hit her face. She called Bet. "It's done," she said. "Good," said Bet, who was clearly awake and had clearly been waiting. "I have a car for you. 5 minutes." Mirabel stood on the sidewalk and breathed. The city moved around her the way it always did. Taxis, someone walking a dog, 2 people arguing gently on the corner. The ordinary and relentless motion of a place that does not stop for anyone's private reckoning. She was tired in a way that went down to her bones. But underneath that, something else. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. She thought about her father's voice on the phone. The table in the conference room that he'd made in Vermont. The company he had built, with the specific intention that she would build it further. She had. She was still doing it. The divorce proceedings took 14 months. There were 3 rounds of mediation, and 1 near miss at litigation, and a period of approximately 6 weeks, during which Mirabel's attorney and Harlow's attorney communicated primarily through very precise, very expensive letters. The partnership entity audit turned up an additional $2 million in positioning that Harlow had not disclosed, money that should have been distributed to the firm but had been quietly redirected. That finding moved the proceedings out of pure divorce territory and into something more serious. Harlow's attorney, to his credit, recognized this quickly and advised settlement. Harlow settled. He walked away from Weston Capital with the personal assets he'd held prior to the marriage and a cash figure that Mirabel's team negotiated down from his initial position by 60%. He had no claim to the firm. He had no ongoing equity position. He signed a non-disparagement agreement and a non-compete clause in financial services that was specific enough to matter. Philippa Strand had ended things with him 4 months into the proceedings. Mirabel knew this because Philippa had, in a move that surprised everyone including Mirabel, reached out to Iris's office to voluntarily provide documentation about certain conversations she'd had with Harlow regarding the firm's structure. It appeared that Harlow had told Philippa things about his plans for Weston Capital that he should not have told anyone. And Philippa had decided that self-preservation was more important than loyalty to someone who had lied to her about the nature of his marriage from the beginning. Mirabel neither celebrated this nor felt particularly sorry for Philippa. She had been lied to. That was real. But she had also made her own choices along the way, with whatever information she'd allowed herself to have. Mirabel filed that reality in the category of things that were true and not her problem, and moved on. On the first Thursday of February, 14 months after the board meeting, Mirabel sat at the head of the mahogany table in the Weston Capital conference room for the first quarterly review of the new year. The room had been subtly rearranged. 3 new board members, 2 from outside the industry, who brought different kinds of rigor, and Douglas, who had stayed and whom she had grown to appreciate more than she expected. Bet brought coffee, real coffee, the kind Mirabel actually liked, not the things that got ordered for meetings because they looked appropriate. The presentation opened with performance metrics. Strong quarter. 2 new institutional clients. A third in late-stage conversations. One of the portfolio positions they'd been watching for 2 years had matured exactly as she'd expected. And the return was the kind that makes board members look at you differently. Not with more respect necessarily, because respect was already established, but with that particular recognition that comes when someone's judgment is vindicated over a long enough time horizon. After the meeting, Douglas stopped her in the hallway. "Your father would have handled it the same way," he said. He did not specify what it was. He didn't need to. Mirabel thought about this on the elevator down. She thought about it in the car on the way home, looking out at the February streets, the bare trees, and the gray sky, and the particular New York afternoon that exists between winter and the thought of something warmer coming. Her father had always said that the most important thing in any negotiation was knowing what you were actually protecting. Not what you were fighting for, what you were protecting. Because when you were clear on that, every decision was easier. Every trade-off became legible. You stopped spending energy on things that weren't the thing, and you put it all on the thing. She had known what she was protecting. She had not spent a single moment doubting it. The office she'd taken over from her father was the same one she'd sat in as a child, doing homework on the floor while he took calls. She'd barely changed it. Same shelves. Same orientation of the desk toward the window. Same view of the city that was different now, because the city was always different, but was also always the same city. She'd added her own things over time. A photograph from a firm anniversary, a small sculpture her sister had given her, a framed letter her father had written her, the year she passed her licensing exams that she had never hung up, and had finally at 41 decided to hang up. She sat down at the desk. She had 37 emails. She had a call at 4. She had a draft deck to review before the weekend, and 2 hiring decisions to make, and a mentorship meeting with a junior analyst named Bryn, who reminded her, in the precise way that is both gratifying and slightly alarming, of herself at 26. She opened her laptop. Outside the window, the city moved. She had built this. Her father had handed her the foundation, and she had built the rest of it, year by year, decision by decision, in the unglamorous and daily way that actual things get built. She had done it through a marriage that turned out to be a long con, and a financial betrayal that could have broken something she cared about. It hadn't broken it. She hadn't let it. There's a particular kind of quiet that comes after a long fight. Not the quiet of emptiness, but the quiet of something stabilized, something that holds. Mirabel Weston knew this quiet well. She'd earned it twice now. Once when she took over the firm at 30, and once when she took it back. She opened the first email. She got back to work.